Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to launch this new public webinar series, Animals, Ethics, and Justice, Beyond the Human, Sharing the Planet with Non-Human Animals. I'm Dr. Kathrin Herrmann, the organizer and host of the series. Over many years working at the intersection of science, law, and policy, one pattern became unmistakable. Animals are consistently treated as background to human life. We manage them as resources in agriculture, as tools in science, and as units in trade, and yet they are individual sentient beings. That reality demands a different ethical and legal response. And this series begins from a simple but urgent question. What would it mean to live responsibly with other animals on a shared planet? Animal protection is not a niche concern. It is inseparable from climate change, biodiversity loss, agricultural systems and land use, as well as scientific knowledge production, and the economic and legal structures that shape life across species. In other words, it is inseparable from the intertwined well-being of animals, human societies, and the ecosystems that sustain us. And so the series is grounded in the idea of multi-species justice. Multi-species justice invites us to expand the scope of justice beyond exclusively human concerns. It recognizes animals as morally relevant beings whose lives are structured by law, market, science, and governance. Justice in this framework must account for the interdependence across species, not only safeguarding human rights, but also ensuring the social and ecological conditions under which non-human life can flourish. Tonight's inaugural talk turns to one of the most formative sites where these assumptions are shaped and reproduced. To introduce our first speaker, Dr. Adam Cardellini. He's senior lecturer in environmental sciences at Deakin University in Melbourne. And Adam's work explores how knowledge, values, and relationships with non-human animals shape science and environmental practice. And his talk is titled Getting Animal Ethics into Science Education, the Potential of Animal Perspective Taking. And as many of you probably know, science education often operates with a very low threshold for justifying animal use. Instrumentalization becomes normalized early in training and frequently without sustained ethical reflection. Adam asked a powerful and challenging question here. What could science look like if we genuinely took animals' interests seriously? And tonight he will introduce the Council of All Beings workshop and reflect on what it means to bring animal ethics more deeply and more intentionally into science education. And now, Adam, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for the invite, Kathrin, and for giving me the opportunity to share some of the stuff that we've been doing down here in Australia, in Deakin. And I'll start the presentation with just a little bit of how I got to this point and the work that I sort of do. I'll speed run through some projects that I'm working on at the moment. So if anyone's interested in getting in touch about those, feel free. You can find me at this email or just look me up and you'll be able to find me. Always happy to chat about projects and collaboration. And just there's only a couple of photos that are, or images that are distressing, but just wanted to mention those. And on the next slide, there is a distressing image. So I'm going to talk about a workshop that I've been developing and running in a unit that I have designed and run in a Bachelor of Science degree in Australia. And thinking about how to sort of fit animal ethics into the context of a science degree in Australia, particularly a very strong animal position. How can we help students consider those perspectives that aren't often given legitimate space within a science curriculum? All right, so I'll just sort of speed run a bit about me and then we'll get into the actual stuff. And I appreciate the opportunity, Kathrin, putting this presentation on, or giving this presentation, because I've not actually shared this learning experience that I've developed, and it's been a good opportunity to think about about it. There's a lot of intention in there, but it sort of has developed over a few years. So I apologize if it's not super clear, but I'm very happy to answer any questions as we get to the end, and clarify anything. So thank you for being the first people to see this. All right. So my background, I'm sort of an ecologist by training and to genomics in my PhD. And during my PhD, had some serious challenges to my understanding of science and how we relate with animals. And that shifted me post PhD to stop working on animals, on them, like exploiting them, towards doing social sciences and ethics. So background in ecology and conservation and genetics, but now very much a social scientist thinking about how we relate with animals and how we can do better by them. And yes, it was through, yeah, I suppose during my PhD, I was working with starlings, and I had a very naive understanding of science, and a very naive understanding of animals. Despite being vegetarian at the time, I still excused serious harms and violence towards animals because I was doing it in the name of science. And once I sort of stood back and reflected on that and questioned how I, someone who ostensibly cared for animals, um, was able to justify serious like violence and the killing of hundreds of individuals. I started to question where those values came from that allowed me to do that. And it quickly became apparent that I had a lot of unexamined values and assumptions, and scientifically. So I had this belief in the primacy and utility of science. I believed in the framing of invasion biology. I was in ecological genomics looking at pest species, and invasive species. And I took that sort of narrative on without much question. And I assumed the scientific narratives matched the evidence. And then when I actually started to do the research in the space, I realized that a lot of those narratives and the ways that we excused our treatment of animals didn't actually match up. And it was mostly that that the things I was doing to animals was justified culturally, but not scientifically. And now I don't think there's much scientific justification for any of the treatments of animals that we perpetrate. But ethically, I had a very instrumental approach to animals and animal ethics. I defaulted to unexamined utilitarian ethics. So through my science degree, it was just that, oh, killing starlings will benefit some other animal, and in the end, it's a greater good. Um, and I had little consideration of individual values. I think this comes from my conservation background, but also just general culture and societal values, right? And I was basically very naive about these values, but it wasn't until I um, was faced with the violence that I like very starkly, right, in my hands, in my face, right in front of me, that I realized how wrong these things were, and that I started to question not only our treatments of animals in science, but all aspects of society, but also science. I really questioned how we justified the things that we did, and questioned a lot of the nature of science from that point. And that'll become apparent later on when we get into the education side of things, and what I sort of try to do and try to bring into my teaching of nature of science. So current focus, research focus, animals and science, basically anything to do with animals I'm interested in, particularly how we treat animals in science, conservation, climate, and how we can do more and better climate action, and then education. How do we help people um, consider other animals better and with higher regard, and ultimately change how people engage and relate to animals. And I'll go quickly through these, but here's a few projects that been recently working on. So if anyone's interested in these, feel free to get in touch to chat about. But have been doing work with PanWorks, some colleagues at PanWorks on compassionate conservation and building out from the ideas around compassionate conservation that were developed by people like Mark Beckhoff and Arian Wallach, and thinking about the various values and principles that go into compassionate conservation. Also pushing back on this idea that compassionate conservation is not something, not an active practice, but or it's a do nothing practice. It's often labeled as and criticized as being do nothing. We asked a bunch of people who are sympathetic or consider themselves compassionate conservationists, and we find that there are plenty of actions that they are happy to do and practice, and there are some that they don't. And you probably won't be surprised by the where certain practices fall, but basically we find that there's a lot of practices in the middle here, which are about people like things just need to be considered in context, and there's not one size fit all answer to a lot of issues in conservation, but we definitely need to give far higher regard and consideration to individual animals in the actions that we take. Of interest perhaps to some people here, Mariam Zemanova and I co-wrote this book chapter, and a bit of tongue-in-cheek, I wanted to go and see what all the different, how the three R's. I'm a bit of a critic of the three R's. I was sort of there's all of over like the 30 years, there's been lots of people that have said, oh no, we need 4 R's or 5 R's or 7 R's. Well, I went and looked at all of those and figured out and sort of did a review and identified all the different R's that people have suggested were lacking from the 3 R's, and then put them into one big approach. And when you make it 11 R's, you can get to a point where it's not too bad. But I don't think 3 R's are quite right. So this is our 11 R's approach. Um, a PhD student of mine, we work on climate-friendly food knowledge and meat consumption. They're working on this idea of climate-friendly food literacy, and they recently found that if you know more about the impacts of the animal agricultural industry, you are more likely to eat far less meat or be vegan. And they're doing a few different pieces of work around that. Shanika Seville, another PhD student of mine, has been working on a taxonomy of climate action. There's this barrier for a lot of people not knowing what they could do in regards to climate, and Shanika's looking at how do we help people who are interested in acting but don't know how to get active, become active. Part of that was finding 365 different climate actions and then categorizing them and seeing doing a content analysis on those to help us think that through a little bit better. Doing a taxonomy of cell ag contrarian claims, similar to climate contrarian claims work, but moving that into cellular agriculture. There's a lot of pushback on cellular agriculture and those ideas, and we've just done a sort of systematic analysis of a whole bunch of claims to identify 55 different types of arguments that are used to push back on cell ag. And then very recently, and actually it's finishes this weekend, but a honours student has been working on this project where we're working with a local bat rescue, and we have put on an open community art exhibition where anyone from the community was free to submit an artwork that focused on celebrating and exploring our relationships and the bats of Geelong, these grey-headed flying foxes. And it's been a really great exhibition, really great experience, and it's been having some good impact on artists and audiences. So there'll be some research on that coming out soon enough. And this is about sort of thinking about how do we connect people with wild lives, not wildlife, but wild lives, individuals who we live and share our cities with. And we are exploring whether art can be a way of helping people connect and care for the wild lives that share our cities. And we're finding that yes, it seems to, by focusing on an individual or an animal carefully in art practice, it can change how people think about and consider those animals. And we've had some participants who have had quite profound changes in their understanding and relationship with bats from participating in the exhibition. So that's quite exciting. And I've got a couple of other projects on trying to determine whether we can use AI to help us do content analysis of journal articles to identify animal use. And we're getting somewhere. It's not as easy as I was hoping it would be, but it's getting there. Doing a systematic review of wildlife considerations and impacts of device attachment in wild animal research, and have a student who's just finishing up actually, who's been working on the idea of what is progress for animals. So basically anything animals I'm very interested in, particularly if it can help us understand our relationships with animals and perhaps um, help us move to better relationships with animals. Okay, animals and science education. So Kathrin gave a great introduction, and I'm sure that most people here are very aware of the problems or the challenges that we face in relation to science education and bringing animals in mindfully and with care and consideration. Um, and I'll give a very brief sort of intro to that, which I think everyone here probably already knows, and then I'll go into what I'm trying to do in my own teaching practice to deal with this or to bring animal ethics into the classroom a bit and get students thinking about animals in a more considerate way. All right, so the next slide does have a bit of a not nice photo or image, just to let you know. So as Kathrin mentioned, the culture of science has some embedded values that are pretty prevalent, and maybe they're stronger and weaker in various combinations depending on who you are and where you are. But there tends to be a lot of human supremacy, with anthropocentrism being the top order, that we are who matter most, and that animals' interests are subservient to our own if we consider them at all. And there's a fair bit of scientism. And I don't necessarily mean hard scientism. This could be a softer scientism where people tend to um, take scientific use as a at face value without interrogation. I'll get a lot of students coming in, and they've never just asked the question. They've never critiqued the idea that science's use of animals is wrong. Uh, and this is because I think science holds this special place in our society. It's sort of revered in certain ways, and it that reverence lends legitimacy to its practices that perhaps those practices don't deserve. And so the combination of scientism and human supremacy mean we have a science where animals are instrumentalized, they're tools of research and education. And um, in education, at least in Australia and my university in particular, where we've briefly looked at this, their use is not clearly disclosed, and our um, conscientious objection protocols only refer to live, living animals, doesn't refer to the tissues or products or byproducts of animals. So there's just like big blind spots. Uh, Animals are delegitimized, and concerns about animals are delegitimized, if you have, maybe people have had this experience, if you have concerns about animals and you bring them to colleagues or the institution, you're not taken seriously, or it's it's already seen as if, we do a 1 day ethics discussion in a 3 year a 3 year degree. So it's not really seriously considered. And processes, well-established processes, act more to legitimize animal use than they do to really push back against harms against animals. Things like animal ethics committees, and the 3Rs provide a veneer of concern rather than a real concern. And there's lots of criticism of the 3Rs, but we still tend to point to them as the evidence that we are doing good by animals at universities and in science. And a lot of, when I've talked or brought issues up to colleagues um, about the use of animals in classes or practicals, in dissections, for instance, they'll dismiss the issue, or with comments like, "Well, they're just waste products of the farming industry, so it's not like anything's actually happened or anyone's been harmed." It's a very, again, instrumentalized understanding of those animals' lives and their bodies, but also the relationality between the students and the animals that we bring into classrooms, dead or alive. And then, you know, animals are dismissed outright, like you're not given time or space to discuss them. There's poor or conscientious objection protocols, certainly true at my university, but many others across Australia. And there's adversarial attitudes to concerns. So I've heard colleagues talk about, if they get a conscientious objection, they will give harder alternative assessments because it's a pain to have to deal with, and these sorts of things. So animals are just not a legitimate concern, it seems, in university settings, or at least in the settings that I've sort of been in a lot of the time. And it's not that individuals don't care about animals. That's certainly not the case. You often find that individuals do care about animals, but in an institution and in a system, um, it's hard to voice those concerns without feeling, uh, yeah, like you might be ostracized or dismissed. So how can we, within that context of science and its treatment of animals, how can we facilitate students to interrogate these issues and consider animals' interests? And so I'll discuss sort of um, how I've approached this and the context within which I'm working at my university, and then a very specific case of how I'm doing that with the Council of All Beings. So I work at Deakin University. We're a rather large university in Australia, at least. I think we've got about 60 to 65,000 students. We have a fairly large science faculty, and I think we're the second largest faculty in the university. Um, and one of our largest courses within my school, the School of Life and Environmental Sciences, is the Bachelor of Science course. It's got a diverse student cohort. At Deakin, we service lots of first in family students, many low SES, low socioeconomic status students, and a variety of students from the suburbs. And the Bachelor of Science is sort of a generalist degree. So it's trying to cover a lot of things. And there's 7 core units. Every student needs to take those, and then they specialize in one of 8 major sequences as well. And I'm lucky enough to teach 2 of the only core units for the degree in second year. One of them is Science and Society. It's a second year core unit. And so um, one of the challenges with bringing animal ethics into, and more consideration of animals into this degree, into this context, is that we have planned courses. So it's not easy to add a new unit. I can't just say, I'm really interested in animal ethics, I want to teach that. It's just not going to fly. Everything's very specific. You need to go through the course team, and it's very, very tight. And there was a lot of rationalization of courses, so we got rid of a lot of units over COVID. So they're not adding new ones. Animal ethics is not a priority. It's seen as something that's already covered. They do, like I said, they do a day in, first year in one unit. And so that's considered as animal ethics being covered, or it's sort of mentioned maybe in some other units, but perhaps mostly in utilitarian approaches. And there's this idea that science students don't need an extensive understanding of animal ethics. It's a challenging topic for many academics, particularly those who participate in research that uses animals. To start questioning that can be very difficult. Science students want science units. So this unit that I teach, Science and Society, it's one of those ones that students sort of groan at having to come into because they're like, this is going to be it's going to be one, it's going to be easy. It'll be an easy one to get through, and I'd rather just be doing chemistry or some other unit. So it's challenging to get buy-in from students, and then we want these sort of experiences to be engaging, so dialectical rather than didactic. So I don't want to be telling students how to think about animals, but helping them facilitate them to approach the issues themselves, being non-judgmental about their own personal perspectives, but while modeling strong conviction for animals. So being able to say that we shouldn't be doing these sorts of things to animals in science whilst teaching within a science degree. And need these things to matter to students, and that's done by making them accessible. Here in Australia, at least, students don't do much unless it's assessed. So I had to think about how do we get animal ethics into the unit that meets these sorts of criteria without tipping people off to maybe making people concerned about its inclusion. So Science and Society is a really natural home for animal ethics discourse within the sciences. And if you've got a unit like that and that's an opportunity for you, I'd really encourage you thinking about that. It's a unit where we critique science in general. That's one of the major parts of the unit. It's about understanding both the qualities of science, but the limitations of it as well, and how societal norms and values influence science and vice versa. And animal ethics is already a contentious issue in this type of curriculum. So it's easy to include it because animal use in science is one of these questions that often comes up in discussions of science and society. Perhaps maybe maybe sometimes in a weaker way, depending on who's teaching, but we wanted to really do it in a way that's very strong from the animal perspective. And I was lucky to the associate director at Deakin. We're very lucky to have a learning innovations team that supports academics in delivering their units, in developing ideas and resources for their units, I must say. And Robin Usel, who's the associate director of that part of the university, is also a nature of science scholar. That's their expertise, and they're very interested in this unit, and so they've been supporting me to develop the unit and also include these sorts of topics in the unit. So got this Science and Society unit where we're talking about animals already, or we've got the opportunity to talk about animals and animal ethics in science. But I wanted to make it more than just, say, a 1 week exploration and then it's forgotten. And I wanted to make it embedded within the assessment of the unit. And so I had to think about, okay, it's good to have that 1 week. So week 4 in this unit is where we talk about the roles and values of values and ethics in science. And animals are the topic, the issue that we focus on in that week. But rather than just have it a one and done, I wanted to think about how do we have the discussion over the trimester, and there's a reason for that we'll get into in a second, and also have an experience that students will remember. And this is so I wanted to embed animals all the way through the unit. That's, yeah, embed the animals all the way through the unit with a big piece towards the end that's accessible and that sort of brings together all of their thinking on animals. And that's the Council of All Beings workshop, where we have a maximum of 25 students in a workshop, and we really get to think about and discuss as a group all of the things that they've been um, learning and thinking about and developing in relation to animals and their animal perspective. And it's very much supported by Associate Professor Bill Borry to pursue this. I was developing the unit a few years ago now, and I was umming and ahhing about putting the coab in, and I'm very glad I did. And it's a three hour workshop at the end of the trimester. So, Council of All Beings. And it's Council of All Beings Light. People might recognize the name because it's from the work of Joanna Marcy and John Seed. In no way is it to compare to their work. Their work is incredible, and it happens over many days, and they've got decades and decades of experience in running those things, the Council of All Beings. But it certainly was something that inspired me, and I loved the idea of having students represent animals in a discussion, and I wanted to think about how do we do that in a way that fits within the unit, that speaks to the science and society aspect of the unit, but also really challenges students in their thinking about animals. And so I'll share sort of what we've been doing over the last couple of years. So co-op learning outcomes, um, um, sort of building this idea of perspectives taking as a tool for understanding other worldviews. The very start of the unit, one of the first things we learn about is worldviews and how worldviews differ, and that makes a difference in how you interpret knowledge and things. So this sort of fits, and we use animals as a way to consider other worldviews and see how worldviews and the consideration of other worldviews can influence how we think about a situation context. Analyze the interplay between science and critically evaluate their treatments of animals. That's what we're trying to get out of this. The framing, students are not so interested necessarily just to learn about animal ethics. And so I've developed a framing that sort of encourages them to think about it as within the context of science and why it should matter to them. And one of the framings I use is like science and ethics equals good policy, but then sort of contrasting that ideal with reality. And when you start to talk about animals and we look at, okay, we've got all this science about about the experience and lives of animals, and we have the ethics that suggests that perhaps we should treat them better. Then you go and look at what we do to animals. There's a failure. And students tend to think that science is, our students anyway, tend to think that science is this really powerful force in the world, and that if you you've got the scientific evidence, then it's going to lead to change. And the animal issue just shows that it's entirely the opposite, that values and culture will hold on to very bad practices, despite all of the science and evidence that you could ask for. And I used a local context of the Victorian animal care and protection laws, which are being renewed. This is a process that's been underway for 5 years, and we get students to look at those laws, thinking about how animals are impacted or and protected or not by these laws. So it makes it very local, very relevant to where they are, and they can go and look up things and find things that are very local to them where they're living. So we're framing it within this context of science ethics, and then the main task that students need to do is take the perspective of animals and represent those animals at this workshop. They need to choose an animal that's subject to the Victorian laws, so it needs to be someone who is in Victoria. Um, they have to try to understand their experience, so that can be. I had a student last year who built up a close relationship with her local magpie family, and every time she'd step outside the door, the magpies would come and say hello and sing to her, and it was a really impactful experience for them. But having that ability to choose an animal that they can actually build a relationship to is important. Um, and then they're comparing animals' experiences with current protection laws. And they need to, at the end, argue for a change to laws that would better protect their interests. So, how do you scaffold that? This is the idea, right? This is what I'm hoping to do, and I'm thinking about how do I scaffold that into the unit, and sort of realize that students don't like you just can't dump them into an experience like that because they have all of this baggage with them. Like we said, with the science education, with how people think about animals in general. So we do a whole bunch of stuff getting them ready and then give them time to think about their animals, understand them. Then the council is the big experience and then they reflect. So it's sort of in 4 parts that this experience happens, and it happens sort of from week 1 all the way through to week 11 of the unit. So getting them ready, that looks like helping them understand what reflection and reflexivity is. Like a lot of our students come in and they've never heard of the term reflexivity, understanding why they think the way that they do or how um, things outside of cultures and values outside of them have influenced their thinking. Get them to think about worldviews, and we talk about other people's worldviews, and then it's not so far a step to talk about a dog's worldview or a mouse's worldview or an animal's worldview, right? Um, Especially when we've got lots of science around those sorts of things. Talk about the civic duty and that there's lots of opportunities for science to engage with issues that matter in society, and the Victorian care and protection laws are this. Lots of people put forward submissions for how to better uh, protect animals and care for animals and improve the laws. So the Council of All Beings is set up as a opportunity for those who didn't necessarily get a voice or an opportunity to speak or to share their submissions to the proposed change to the laws, the animals. They are now representing those animals and putting forward those animals' perspectives on the laws. And then legitimizing political representation of animals. Plenty of students do come in open and already caring about animals, but there are many that don't understand why we would need political representation of animals. So all of this is sort of preparatory work for the council itself. Without this sort of stuff, I don't think it would work very well. And they read things like the excellent book. I give them several chapters in Meet the Neighbours by Brandon Keam, which is a really accessible, beautifully written, and compelling book. If you've not read it, I'd strongly advise. It's a really wonderful piece of work. So we do this preparatory work to say, yes, this is something that we should think about and talk about, and you don't need to scoff at the idea of caring and considering animals. Then they're sent away to choose an animal to represent, and they need to choose it from 5 domains: companionship, entertainment, research, food and fiber, and subject to environmental management. And they research their animal's perspective through science, through videos, through meeting and building a relationship with them if they get that opportunity. And then they look at the experience of animals in Victoria, real current contemporary experiences of animals in Victoria, and they look at the laws and see how the animals are protected or not from the laws, and they prepare a 2-minute speech. And the 2-minute speech is what they give at the Council of All Beings. And at the Council of All Beings, it's broken into several sections where we introduce the what we're going to be doing over the next 3 hours. And one of the things that has to be reiterated time and time again and doesn't really sit with the students until like halfway through the council is to step outside their own perspective. They struggle so hard with that, despite telling them every week for 10 weeks, right? Be bold. Don't be sort of derailed by anthropocentric instrumentalist values about animals. If if you think what the animal is experiencing is something they don't want, what would they ask for? Trying to get students to that point is really, really difficult, but it seems we tend to eventually get there during the council. So they have time to chat with each other, break the ice, and then speeches. And everyone goes one by one, 25 students. They're all speaking about various things. And this is an opportunity where they're actually getting to hear about the lives and experiences of animals that they might not have ever thought about. And it can be quite a intense but powerful approach where I'm not up there telling them all the horrible things that happen to animals in Victoria down the road from them at the farm or at the slaughterhouse or at the entertainment place, but they're telling each other and recognizing what they're sharing is legitimate because they've done research and what they're sharing about their animal is legitimate. And then they get into during their speeches, they have to put forward some policy changes for the laws, and they put these up on post-it notes on a big board. And after all the speeches, we group those into 4 categories, and they get into groups to discuss those. And I'll talk about that in just a sec. And these are the sorts of short speeches that students will give. This student was representing brown snakes, eastern brown snakes, a venomous snake here in Australia. And they often take the perspective of the animal directly, speaking in their voice. They talk about the realities of the law. They're talking about the failures of the law, right? They're really considering reality and the legal system and how it's not working for animals. And they can sometimes get quite nuanced and identify really interesting points like here, but words are not enough if exceptions remain. If cruelty can still be excused as reasonable, and if management continues to mean suffering for me and my kin. So in the laws, they say, yeah, we want to protect all these great animals, except where it's reasonable to do otherwise. And so lots of students pick up on the these qualifying words that basically allow industry or anyone to harm animals for whatever excuse they like. And they're starting to see how, despite all of this science that we have about the experience and lives of brown snakes and the nice words that we say about them in our law, then in reality, these things don't happen. Or the laws are written to excuse bad behavior or bad experiences, bad actions towards animals. Yeah. So once they've done the speeches, they get into these groups, and it's grouped into these 4 categories. We'll have maybe 50 different suggestions, and maybe it's 12 each into each category. They go off into groups and discuss those, and they've got to condense those down into 2 laws that they propose for that category. So going from care and protection, they've got 12 suggestions. They don't just take the best 2. They need to consider all 12, see the themes that are coming through from the various animals in the room, and think about, okay, if we think about all of these together, what is the best thing we can do for the majority of animals in this council? And they sometimes come up with really great suggestions. one of the things that I've got to tell them here again is to, you know, some of them get stuck on practicalities and saying, well, it's not realistic. And I try to push them out of that. You know, this is a fantasy, and we're imagining what would the world be like if we truly considered animals' perspectives and their interests. So ask for what the animal would ask. So there's pushback all the way through usually, but you can get them there with proper coaxing. Um, and these are sorts of things that they come up with. So we'll have eight different proposals in each of the workshops, and they're all over the place usually. But what I've noticed is that students become bolder and are willing to put forward stronger positions for animals when they're in a group than individually. They'll often stand up and they'll give some sort of welfareist perspective, very anthropocentric perspective when they give their speech. When they hear some other students doing something more bold from their animal's perspective, and you encourage them to do the same, they tend to come together at this point, and this is where they really learn together. Um, and then we go to a vote, and there's only three of the laws get through in this workshop, and they've got to spruik and discuss. They've got like 10, 15 minutes to discuss, go around the room and argue for why people should vote for the laws that they've put forward, and it's an opportunity again to get them talking about um, their animals' experiences, why this particular law will do the best for all animals, or why people should vote for them. And what we tend to see is you get votes for broader fundamental change, right? They're getting here. Care and protection should mean fundamental animal rights, right? That would be a um, much better inclusion into the care and protection laws for animals if we were really to want to care and protect them. Universal health care for animals, you know, some really interesting suggestions they come up with together, thinking from the perspective of animals. And then after the COAB, for their final assessment, they write a reflection, and they need to think about how the experience has influenced their understanding of science and the relationship between science and society, but also how perspectives taking has impacted them. And um, again, here's from student 10 who presented or represented the brown snakes. And I'm doing some work with Robin where we've collected, you know, we've got about 35 students who were happy to participate in a research project where we look at their final assessments, which includes this COAB reflection, and we'll be doing some research on that. But you know, saying things like researching their ecological role and imagining their lived experience shifted that fear into empathy. So they're talking about a change within themselves about the eastern brown snake through this experience. This other student had quite a lot of good things to say actually, but I've just highlighted some of the points that I find quite powerful. But taking another's perspective reshaped my ethical lens. Rather than weighing costs and benefits abstractly, I imagined them from the standpoint of those directly subjected to harm. Then they go on to negotiating competing interests expose the complexity and hidden grey areas inherent in policy development. We need to restate that harm in any case would be illegal under the new policy unless the animals benefited. So they're finding nuanced um, understandings of how we might relate to animals and protect animals and care for them, not just with blanket can't harm them at all, which might mean you couldn't intervene for medical reasons, but thinking more carefully about how we can continue to help animals flourish. And then stepping into the life of monkeys with both confronting and transformative. While I began with a utilitarian outlook that balanced harms and benefits, the process shifted me towards recognizing the intrinsic rights of animals to live free from exploitation. And some reflections. I know I've gone way over time, I think, but some reflections. Students want to discuss tough issues, and at Deakin we do a lot of online teaching. So this is their only opportunity in my unit to come together and work together on campus, and they really enjoy it. They really enjoy doing something that's quite different. A lot of science students don't really get why we're doing this to begin with, but through the process they really get into it. it's important to sell the theatre. So when delivering, I deliver it as if we are in a council or in a parliamentary question time. We're very formally asking them to rise and present their speech and then moving on. You need a good facilitator who gets it. I have tended to be at almost all of them, and you need someone who's able to really push the students on stepping outside of their anthropocentrism. There's workshops can go certain ways depending on the group, and you might get less sort of animal-centered suggestions if the students aren't really challenged to push outside of that anthropocentrism. Um, yeah, you gotta tell them to be bold. You gotta tell them to step outside, and then it can be challenging to students. Like a lot of students do reflect that it's hard to think about animals in this way and consider them differently, but they often find it really beneficial and valuable. And AI is you get students using AI, but the benefit for that is if you go for a very strong animal perspective and position, AI sucks. I don't know if you've ever tried to ask AI to represent a sheep and tell me how to change the laws to benefit sheep. It tends to talk about, really pathetic welfarist sort of changes rather than really from the perspective of the sheep who might not want to be used for food and fiber at all. AI just doesn't get there. So it's easy to spot those students that do uh, use AI. And just final sort of quote from a student. Thinking from the perspective of one such animal, a mouse, promoted me to weigh the mouse's interests against the needs of humans and to see the injustice from the perspective of a mouse. It made me realize reflexively that my education had normalized such marginalization by implying it to be inevitable, though the preparation and participation in the COAB challenged this assumption. That's me. Sorry I went for so long. I didn't realize there's so much to talk about. Um, and yeah, happy for any conversations and questions.